Wife vanished after a girls' trip and came back years later with a baby. I made her regret it. You know how people always say things like, "I never saw it coming"? Well, that's exactly how it was for me. My wife and I were together for a solid 4 years, married for all of it. I honestly thought we had a good thing going. We had plans, a whole life mapped out, and for the most part, I really thought we were on the same page. Now here's the thing. We both wanted kids. Or at least, I thought we both did. Right after we got married, we started talking about it seriously. She'd always say how she wanted 2 or 3 kids, kept going on about what we'd name them, how we'd decorate the nursery, the whole thing. She'd even sit online looking at baby clothes and baby gadgets, planning this life with our future kids. It was kind of our thing to talk about it, something that kept us close. So we were excited, ready to start this next chapter together. And everything seemed perfect. But then we got hit with some bad news that just knocked the wind out of me. After a few months of trying to have kids, we went to a doctor to see what was going on. Long story short, it was me. My count was way too low, and the doctor basically told us that the chances of us having kids naturally were slim to none. It was like a punch to the gut. I felt useless. All those plans we had, just gone in an instant. The news hit me hard, like really hard. I ended up in a pretty bad place for a while. Therapy eventually helped, but at the start, I was a total mess. She seemed pretty supportive at first, saying it didn't matter and that she'd be happy with just the 2 of us. But even from the beginning, there was something off about how she said it. It's like she just dropped it way too quickly. One minute, she was all about having a family, and the next, she's saying she didn't need kids to be happy. Now, don't get me wrong. I get that people change their minds, but her whole attitude felt weird to me. She'd gone from daydreaming about baby names to just flat out avoiding any talk about kids. And not just that, it was like she started seeing me differently too. Out of nowhere, she'd make these small digs at me, stuff she'd never said before. Comments about how I wasn't taking care of myself, how maybe I should get in shape or be more productive around the house. And yeah, maybe I'd put on a few pounds, but it was like she was just finding things to blame me for. When I confronted her, asking what was up with the sudden attitude change, she'd brush it off. She'd tell me I was imagining things, that I was just being overly sensitive. But I knew something was up. The woman I married, the one who used to sit with me for hours talking about our future, she was different. She wasn't mean, exactly, but there was this coldness, like she'd already checked out mentally and was just going through the motions. And over time, I guess I started to believe her when she said everything was fine. I stopped pushing because I didn't want to come across as insecure or needy. Anyway, fast forward a few years, and we were just living day by day. We'd fallen into this routine where we barely talked about anything meaningful. It was like we were roommates more than husband and wife. I tried bringing up other options, adoption, surrogacy, but every time she'd shut it down, saying she didn't want to think about it. She'd say, "I'm happy as long as we're together." But I never fully bought it. It felt like she was trying to convince herself more than me. Then, out of nowhere, she tells me she wants to go on a girls' trip. Now, it wasn't unusual for her to go on trips with her friends. She'd done it a few times before, and I always supported her. We lived in Brighton, and she'd talked about how she wanted to go to America with her friends for a while. I didn't think twice about it because we'd built up this trust over the years. So I even helped her pack, made sure she had everything she needed, and dropped her off at the airport. I remember the last thing she said before she left. She turned to me and said, "Thank you for being so supportive." I thought it was a little weird that she'd say that. It's not like I'd done anything special. But she seemed so genuine, so I brushed it off as her just being appreciative. That night, I stayed up so I could call her once she landed, just to make sure everything went smoothly. Her flight was supposed to take about 9 hours, so I kept myself busy around the house watching TV, checking the clock, and waiting for her to text me that she'd landed. Once I saw her flight had touched down, I gave her a call to check in. The phone rang and rang, but no answer. I figured she was tired, maybe went straight to her hotel and crashed, so I didn't think too much of it. But then morning rolled around, and I still hadn't heard from her. I started feeling this gnawing worry in the pit of my stomach. I tried calling again, then sent a few texts, thinking maybe she was just busy or her phone was on silent. But after a few more hours of radio silence, I was officially freaking out. I ended up calling her sister to see if maybe she'd heard from her. Nothing. By now, I was seriously starting to panic. I even went as far as calling her friends, the ones who were supposed to be on the trip with her, thinking maybe something had gone wrong with her phone, or maybe she just hadn't had the chance to check in. But when I called them, they were confused too. Because they weren't on the trip with her. They were sitting 2 blocks away back home, having coffee. That was when it really hit me. She wasn't on a girls' trip. She wasn't with friends. She hadn't gone anywhere with anyone. She was just gone. I sat there, holding the phone, and it felt like my stomach dropped through the floor. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Why would she lie to me like that? Why would she just leave without telling me? I tried to convince myself it was some kind of mistake, like maybe she'd missed a connecting flight, or there had been some emergency, and she hadn't been able to call. But deep down I knew she'd planned this. The whole girls' trip thing, her saying thank you for being supportive, it was all part of whatever she'd been cooking up in her head. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was living in some nightmare where I couldn't wake up. This wasn't the woman I'd married. This was someone I didn't even recognize. All the pieces started clicking together. The coldness, the way she'd stopped talking about our future, those little jabs about my looks and my health. She'd been pulling away for a long time and I just hadn't seen it, or maybe I hadn't wanted to see it. That night, I just sat there staring at my phone, hoping for a text, a call, anything. But nothing came, and deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Waking up the next morning, I remember just lying there, staring at the ceiling, hoping maybe it was all some messed up dream. But her side of the bed was empty, and reality hit hard. She'd actually left. She'd packed her bags and vanished. And all those reassurances I'd told myself the night before that maybe she was delayed or her phone died, they didn't hold up anymore. It was obvious. She'd planned this and wanted out. The first few days, I was in total denial. I'd keep calling her phone, hoping I'd hear her voice on the other end, maybe get an explanation. I even left messages. I didn't know what to say half the time, but I kept leaving them, hoping something would get through to her. But all I got was silence. At first, her family was as shocked as I was. Her mom didn't know anything about her plans, and they hadn't heard from her either. I ended up going over there more times than I could count, talking to her mom, looking for answers. I think they felt bad for me. Her mom would let me crash there some nights, even made me meals when I couldn't bring myself to cook. She'd sit there, listening to me talk about all the little things that didn't make sense, trying to piece together how my life had blown up without warning. And I'll be honest, sometimes I just sat there in silence, too numb to say anything. I went from one extreme to another, anger, sadness, guilt. I kept asking myself what I did wrong. Did I miss some sign? Did I not give her enough attention? There were days I'd go over every conversation we'd had, every fight, trying to figure out what pushed her to leave. I kept running through my mind how I might have saved our marriage, what I could have done differently. I know it sounds dramatic, but I was obsessed with figuring it out, like finding an answer could somehow fix everything. I barely ate, barely slept, and my work started slipping too. People noticed. They'd ask if I was okay, and I'd just shrug it off, say I was dealing with personal stuff. It was embarrassing to admit what had happened, to say out loud that my wife left me without a word. Eventually, I did tell a couple of close friends, and they did their best to keep me distracted, dragging me out to hang out, trying to get me to move on. But even when I was with them, I'd be in my head thinking about her, wondering where she was and why I wasn't enough to make her stay. One of the worst parts was the constant questions from people who didn't know. Neighbors, family, friends, even old coworkers who'd heard I was married would ask, "How's married life treating you? And how's your wife?" Every time it was like ripping off a fresh scab. I didn't have the guts to tell them she'd left, so I'd just smile and say everything was fine. But that lie felt heavier every time I told it. Therapy ended up being the only thing that helped. I'd never gone before, but after a few months of barely functioning, I knew I couldn't handle it on my own anymore. So I found a therapist and started going every week. Talking to someone neutral, someone who didn't know her or me or any of our baggage, helped. I'd vent about the anger, the betrayal, the hole she'd left in my life. I'd go on about the sleepless nights, how I'd lie awake replaying everything over and over. The therapist helped me see that there was no magic moment that would have kept her here. She made the choice to leave, and that was on her, not me. That was a hard pill to swallow. For the longest time, I felt like there was something wrong with me, that I'd somehow driven her away. But slowly, I started seeing things differently. She'd been cold and distant for a long time, and I just ignored it, hoping things would get better on their own. I'd convinced myself that I could hold it all together, that somehow my effort alone was enough to keep our marriage alive. It was painful to accept that it wasn't. As time went on, I started taking small steps to rebuild my life. I'd lost a lot of myself in our marriage, and I hadn't realized it until she left. I'd always been the guy who made an effort, who'd go out of his way to make sure she was happy, to make sure our home life was comfortable. But now I had all this time on my hands, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I started picking up old hobbies again, stuff I'd forgotten about. I went to the gym, started reading books I'd been putting off, even tried cooking new recipes. Work eventually got better too. At first, I was just going through the motions, barely keeping up with my workload. But as I started feeling more like myself, I put more effort into my job. It was one of the few things that made me feel accomplished, like I still had control over something in my life. I'd always been good at what I did, but now I put my all into it. The extra hours, the focus. It paid off in the form of a promotion that I never would have gotten if I'd been wallowing in self-pity. Still, there were days that hurt. Every once in a while, I'd come across something that reminded me of her. A photo, an old movie ticket stub, little things that brought back memories I'd tried to forget. I'd look at them and wonder what she was doing, if she ever thought about me, if she ever regretted what she did. But those moments started to fade, bit by bit. Each time, I was able to pack away those memories a little quicker, move on a little easier. I also reconnected with friends I hadn't seen much since I got married. We started doing things again, hitting up the golf range, going on hikes, stuff I hadn't done in years. It felt good to have people in my corner, people who weren't part of the mess, who could help me move on without dragging me back into the pain. Looking back, I realized I'd put way too much of myself into that relationship, into being her husband. When she left, it felt like she'd taken a part of me with her, like I'd lost this huge chunk of who I was. But piece by piece, I was finding myself again. It wasn't easy and it wasn't quick, but I was getting there. By the end of that year, I could finally look in the mirror and see someone who wasn't defined by what she'd done. I was more than just the guy whose wife left him. I'd survived, I'd rebuilt, and I'd come out stronger. For the first time in years, I felt like I could actually live my life without her shadow hanging over me. And honestly, I was proud of that. I thought I'd put everything behind me. Life had finally started feeling normal again, or at least as close to normal as it could get after all that mess. I had my routine down, friends keeping me busy, and work was actually going great. I'd even stopped thinking about her every day. I mean, I still had my moments where some random memory would sneak up on me, but it wasn't like before, where every second of my life was somehow connected to her. So when there was a knock on my door one Saturday morning, she was the last person I expected to see standing there. But there she was, right on my doorstep, holding a baby. I froze. My brain just stopped working for a second, because it was like seeing a ghost. She looked pretty much the same, maybe a little worn down, but still her. She gave me this look like she actually thought I'd be happy to see her. And yeah, that hit me hard because I thought I was past caring. Turns out, seeing her again stirred up a lot of emotions I thought I'd buried. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, staring. She smiled at me like nothing had happened. And then, with zero shame, she asked, "Can I come in?" The nerve. I mean, really. After everything she'd done, she just shows up here like I'm supposed to welcome her back with open arms. But I kept my cool, told her no, you can stay right there and explain. I didn't want her in my house, bringing all that chaos back into the place I'd built up again, the one space I'd made mine. She looked a bit thrown off, but she stayed where she was and just dove into her story. She started with, "I know this might be a shock, but I wanted to come back and explain everything." She even had this hopeful look on her face, as if she genuinely believed I'd be open to hearing her out. I was torn between laughing in her face and just shutting the door right there. But I was too curious. I wanted to know what her excuse was, what she'd come up with to justify the way she'd vanished. She went on, talking about how she'd made a mistake leaving, how she'd realized she'd lost the best thing that had ever happened to her. Her words, not mine. She said she'd spent a lot of time reflecting, and that after having this baby, she finally understood what really mattered in life. Apparently, what really mattered was showing up unannounced at my door after ghosting me for years. And that's when she looked down at the baby and said, "This is our second chance." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Our second chance? Like this kid was supposed to be some magical reset button, and we just pick up right where we left off. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was absolutely fuming. She went on saying how she wanted us to be a family again, that she'd made a terrible mistake, but now we could start fresh, just the three of us. Finally, I asked the one question that had been eating at me since she showed up. Why did you leave? I kept my voice as steady as I could, but I wasn't sure how much longer I'd be able to hold back. I'd spent years trying to understand, torturing myself with all the possibilities, and now that she was here, I needed to hear it from her. She hesitated, looking down at her feet like she was ashamed, but eventually she told me the truth, or what I assumed was the truth. She admitted she'd left because she wanted a kid, and since I couldn't give her one, she'd found someone who could. She actually said it like it was no big deal, as if she hadn't shattered my life, as if I was supposed to just nod and accept it. She explained that the guy she'd left with didn't stick around, but by then she'd had the baby and realized she wanted me back. Just like that, simple. I took a minute to process what she was saying. Here she was admitting that she'd abandoned me, ran off with some guy, had his kid, and now expected me to be okay with it, as if I were just to forgive and forget. I told her, "So you left, found someone else, had his baby, and now you think you can come back and pretend like nothing happened? She started crying, saying she was sorry that she'd made a huge mistake, but that didn't move me at all. She kept saying how she realized that I was the one she truly loved and that we were meant to be together. Honestly, it was hard to keep a straight face. I couldn't believe how delusional she sounded. This wasn't love, this was desperation, and I could see it all over her face. Then she tried to guilt trip me, going on about how it wasn't easy being a single mom, how hard it had been for her. She actually tried to make herself the victim in all this, as if her choices hadn't led her exactly to where she was now. She told me she needed my support, that she was ready to make things work this time. The whole time I just kept thinking, who does she think I am? I stood there taking it all in, but at this point, I was done listening. I told her straight, Uphell, you made your choice a long time ago, and now you have to live with it. There's no second chance here. She looked stunned, as if she'd never even considered that I'd say no, as if she really thought she could just waltz back into my life because it was convenient for her. Then, just when I thought she'd finally get it and leave, she got mad. Her tone changed, and she started yelling at me, saying I was being selfish, that I owed her a chance to make things right. She said that if she'd wanted to, she could have divorced me back then and taken half of everything. She even had the nerve to bring up the house, saying it should still be hers. It was like her true colors were coming out right in front of me. I felt a wave of relief. I was finally seeing her for who she really was. I didn't argue with her. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her and said, "We're done. You wanted a different life, and now you have it. This isn't my responsibility anymore." With that, I shut the door in her face, cutting off whatever final words she had left. Standing there, hearing her muffled shouts from the other side of the door, I felt a strange calm wash over me. She could knock, yell, cry, whatever, but I knew I'd never let her back in. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd married, she was gone, and in her place was a stranger who thought she could pick up the pieces when it suited her. I walked away from the door and sat down, feeling lighter than I had in years. After I slammed the door on her, I thought that was it. I figured she'd get the message and just leave. But no. Instead, she started banging on the door, yelling all kinds of things. I couldn't believe the nerve. There I was, in the one place that was mine, the one place I'd managed to rebuild from the mess she'd left me in, and she had the audacity to stand there, demanding I listen to her. At first I thought about ignoring it, just letting her scream until she got tired. But then I got curious. I wanted to hear what kind of reasons she'd come up with this time. So I opened the door just a crack, enough to show her that I was listening but not letting her in. She looked like she'd just taken a slap to the face, probably shocked that I hadn't given her the reaction she wanted. She launched into this whole monologue about how she was willing to forgive me for slamming the door on her, and how she was ready to start fresh, as if we were just having a normal spat, not dealing with her abandonment. She kept going on about how we could make things work if we both put in the effort. At that point, I couldn't hold back. I laughed, actually laughed, because the sheer nerve of this woman was beyond anything I'd ever seen. She looked furious when I did that, as if I were supposed to feel bad for not taking her seriously. I told her, "You left, you had your chance, and you threw it all away. I'm not just going to pretend none of that happened because you feel like it." Her face went red, and she started saying things like, "You don't understand how hard it was for me." She went on about how she'd been so lost after leaving, and how she'd realized too late that she'd made a mistake, but I wasn't buying it. I told her that leaving was a choice she made. She had planned it, lied about it, and then went through with it. Her regret didn't mean anything now. And that's when she snapped. Her whole tone changed. She dropped the sad, remorseful act and started going off on me, saying how I was being unfair, how I didn't have the decency to give her another chance. She actually had the guts to say, "If I'd wanted to, I could have taken everything from you back then. I could have taken half of everything you own." I just stood there, amazed. This woman who'd left me without a word now thought she was entitled to some kind of reward for not trying to ruin me financially, as if she deserved credit for not being as terrible as she could have been. I told her, "So what? Am I supposed to be grateful? Grateful that you only ditched me and didn't take my stuff with you?" She stared at me, her face a mix of anger and something else. Maybe desperation, maybe guilt. But honestly, by that point I didn't care. I was just done. All those years I'd spent feeling guilty, questioning myself, wondering if I was somehow responsible for her leaving, they melted away right there. I finally saw her for who she was, and it felt like the weight I'd been carrying around was finally lifted. She wasn't done though. She started pacing on my porch, ranting about how I'd never find anyone like her and how I'd regret not giving her another chance. She actually tried to make me feel like I was the one who was missing out by not taking her back. It was bizarre. Here she was, the one who destroyed everything we had, acting like I should be begging her to stay. When she saw that I wasn't budging, she got even louder, going on about how I'd forced her to leave in the first place. She claimed that if I'd been more understanding about the whole kid thing, none of this would have happened. Apparently, according to her logic, my inability to give her a child meant I had failed her as a husband, which somehow justified her running off to have one with someone else. The mental gymnastics were impressive, honestly. I couldn't believe she was trying to pin her choices on me. I told her flat out, "Look, if you wanted a kid that badly, you could have told me the truth. You didn't have to lie to my face and pretend everything was fine while planning your exit." She had nothing to say to that, just stared at me like I'd slapped her. But I didn't let her get a word in. I went on telling her, "You made that choice all on your own, and now you've got to live with it. That's not my problem." She tried one last angle, switching back to her sad face, asking me to think about the child and how I was being unfair by turning my back on him. She had the kid in her arms, and she actually used him to guilt trip me like I was the bad guy here, but I wasn't falling for it. I told her, "I don't know that child. I have nothing to do with him. He's not mine, and neither are you." And that was it. I could see the realization finally sinking in for her. She knew I wasn't going to change my mind, that there was no way I'd let her back into my life. I could see the anger fading, replaced by something else. Maybe actual regret, maybe just frustration. But it didn't matter to me. She was just a stranger now. A stranger who had tried to walk all over me and expected me to smile and thank her for it. She stood there for a few more seconds, like she was waiting for me to change my mind, to call her back. But I didn't say another word. I just stood there, watching her face as it finally dawned on her that I meant every word. Then, without another look, I shut the door, and this time, I didn't wait for her to bang on it again. I knew deep down that I'd made my decision, and there was no going back. I walked away from the door feeling, I don't know, like I'd finally won. She'd spent so much time thinking she could come back and manipulate her way into my life again, but it was over. I was free. There wasn't going to be a second chance. Not for her, not for us. She was just a memory now, one I'd finally put in the past where she belonged. After all those years of guilt and pain, I finally felt like I could breathe again. And you know what? It felt good. The moment I closed that door on her, I felt this strange calm wash over me. I wasn't angry or sad or even shocked anymore. It was like every ounce of energy I'd spent on her for years, all the regret, the guilt, the endless wondering, it just vanished. I'd finally gotten the closure I didn't know I needed, and I was ready to move forward. It was over, for real this time, but of course, things didn't end as cleanly as I hoped. A few days later, I got a text from her mom. She was apologizing, saying she was ashamed of how her daughter had handled everything and that she'd tried to talk some sense into her, but obviously it hadn't worked. Her mom was a good person. She'd helped me out a lot after her daughter left, and I could tell she was genuinely upset about the whole thing. I didn't hold anything against her, but I wasn't interested in being roped back into that mess. I just replied with a polite, "Thanks for checking in," and left it at that. I wasn't going to give her mom any more details, and I wasn't going to waste time explaining my decision. She understood enough to know it was over. Over the next few weeks, I heard bits and pieces through mutual friends and social media. Apparently, she'd gone back to living with her parents, and it wasn't going smoothly. The guy she'd left me for, the kid's father, wasn't involved at all. He'd completely bailed. I guess he hadn't signed up for the long haul, and now she was stuck figuring it out on her own. She'd pretty much burned every bridge, so there weren't many people willing to lend a hand. Her old friends, the ones who were on my side when she first disappeared, had no sympathy for her. They'd all moved on and weren't too keen on getting dragged back into her drama. Can't blame them. Her parents weren't exactly thrilled either. They weren't in a great financial position to support her and a baby. I knew this because, not long after the text from her mom, I got a call from her dad. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the best of me. He was polite, but direct, said they were struggling to make ends meet, and hinted that maybe I could help out a bit. He said, "We know you cared about her once," and kept going on about the baby and how hard things were for them. I listened politely, but when he started going on about how his daughter just needs a little support to get back on her feet, I couldn't help but laugh a little. Not out loud, but you get the point. I told him as nicely as I could that his daughter's choices were her own, and that I wasn't in any position or mindset to help. I think he got the message because he didn't press further. The next thing I know, her friends start reaching out, people I hadn't heard from in years. A few tried the guilt angle, saying she was going through a rough time, and that maybe I could find it in my heart to give her another chance. Another friend of hers even had the nerve to suggest that the kid needed a father figure, and that I shouldn't let my bitterness get in the way of helping him out. But I stood my ground. I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel bad for finally choosing myself after years of feeling like I'd never be enough. I'd given that woman everything I had, and she'd thrown it away. The least she could do was own her choices instead of expecting me to bail her out. Over time, the calls and messages slowed down, and eventually, they stopped altogether. It was like everyone finally understood that I was serious, that I'd moved on and wasn't going to be roped back in. And that's when the real peace set in. My life felt quiet, normal, in a way it hadn't in years. I had my routines, my friends, my work. It wasn't a fancy, glamorous life, but it was mine. And I'd built it back up on my terms. The funny thing is, I started finding happiness in the little things again. Stuff I hadn't really noticed when I was married. I'd go for walks, cook my own meals, read books I'd meant to get to for years. The freedom was refreshing, and I realized I didn't need anyone's permission to live the way I wanted. For once, I wasn't constantly worried about someone else's approval or happiness. It was like I'd gotten my life back, piece by piece. Every now and then, I'd run into someone who knew both of us, and they'd ask, "Hey, whatever happened with her?" I'd give a brief, polite answer and change the subject. It wasn't that I was hiding anything. I just didn't want to keep revisiting a chapter that was so clearly over. She was part of my past, and I'd finally learned how to leave her there. As for her, last I heard, things weren't going great. She was struggling to keep a job, still bouncing between her parents' place and friends' couches when she wore out her welcome. People I barely talked to anymore would message me occasionally, telling me she was asking for help from just about anyone who'd listen. Some of them even hinted that she was hoping I'd change my mind, that maybe I'd come around and decide to play dad to her kid after all. But that wasn't going to happen. I'd spent too much time and energy getting my life back to even think about going down that road. I wasn't going to be her safety net. Wasn't going to be the guy who picks up the pieces just because things didn't work out the way she planned. I was done with that chapter, and nothing was going to drag me back in. In the end, I feel like I got the closure I needed. She'd made her choices, and now she was dealing with the consequences. And me, I finally felt free, truly, genuinely free. In a way I hadn't felt since the day she left. I was done letting her shadow hang over my life. I'd moved on, and I was content. Not happy in some big dramatic way, but quietly, peacefully content. And you know what? That was enough.